Now, do you ever feel like you want to go off-grid? No phone, no Wi-Fi, no emails? Well, a campaign is growing to give us, more of us, that opportunity. 1,000 huts want Scots to have access to a place where we can escape the 21st century. That might mean more of us having access to a hut, anything from a shed to a chalet in the woods. Our environment correspondent David Miller has been to find out more.
I've come to this Forestry Commission woodland near Salin in Fife because there's an idea for this place which campaigners hope could transform our relationship with the countryside and even, well, make us all happier. What's the big plan?
Well, this is the corner of this little woodland that we think would be most suitable for huts. So we're working closely with the Forestry Commission Scotland, who manage this woodland on our behalf, on a pilot study. So we think we can get maybe 10 or 12 huts into this area, which would be a place for people to come and use at weekends and so on.
So people would build their own huts here?
That's the idea, yeah. They would lease the ground from the Forestry Commission at, we hope, a nice affordable sort of rent. And then they would have the opportunity to either build their own hut or to get a friend or find somebody to build them a hut. And then that would be their little plot, which they could come back to for weekends.
The community planned for this wood is part of a long tradition of hutting in Scotland. There have always been small clusters of improvised homes, from sheds to chalets in the woods. Even the Bruins had their butt and ben. But the aim here is to kickstart a process which will lead to 1,000 new huts.
We live very cluttered lives. There's a lot of electronic stuff going on in our lives. This would be a place you could just come and listen to the bird song, listen to the sound of the rain on the roof. Families, little kids running through the woods, making dens. Just leave all that kind of urban clutter behind for a period of time, for a weekend or for your summer holidays or whatever.
The aim is to make this a cheap way for a wide range of people to reconnect with nature.
And we see the huts as being particularly attractive to people on a lower income, and so we want to make them affordable for everybody. It's not to say that they're only going to be for those people, but they're open to everybody, and it's up to everybody to decide how best they can use the opportunity.
One of those people is Linda Moyes. She lives just a mile away in the village of Salin.
Well, although I live in the countryside and I've got a lovely garden, there's always distractions like the phone ringing or housework or going on the computer, so you don't always come outside and you don't always hear the wildlife because there's maybe cars and all sorts of noises. And the idea of being a mile away would be you feel like you're 100 miles away when you're in the woodland down there. The tranquility of a woodland is beautiful. You could stay overnight in your hut as well if you want to. You can be with like-minded people, and I can use my electric bike to get down there. I don't need to use the car because it's only a mile down the road.
The site is interesting, but there's a precedent for all this. It's not difficult to imagine huts dotted around the landscape here, children playing, building dens, their parents disconnecting from their workaday lives, reconnecting with nature. That's the vision for the future here, but it's still the reality in some other places in Scotland where hutting has continued for generations now, and that's where we're heading next. Here at Carbeth on Glasgow's northwestern edge, there are over 100 huts. This community was started by returning soldiers after the First World War and has always had deep working-class roots. But for people here, it has a modern purpose too.
Hutting life just changes your life. It changes the rhythm of your life. It slows everything down a bit. You can't always be jumping onto Google to see what that means or what that's about or anything like that. You just have to do things at a slightly different pace and think about things like where your water comes from, where your wood comes from. It really enhances, for me, my relationship with the natural world.
Morven and the other tenants here have had to fight to keep their huts. Rent disputes and the threat of eviction led them to buy the land last year. So what are the lessons of Carbeth for potential new sites elsewhere?
If you're always beholden to somebody else, then surely you're always worrying about how secure your hut is, how secure your access to your hut is. So if we're really to go for that Scandinavian model of more people having a hut, more people being able to access huts easily, freely, regularly, then we need to be able to sure that folk can get onto the land.
These huts at Barry Downs near Dundee are testament to that. They were pulled down after the landowner legally evicted the tenants. Many others suffered the same fate. That may be why in Scotland the last census of huts found just 629, whereas in Norway, a country with a smaller population than ours, around 400,000 people have access to a cabin. Carbeth's future is secure. Whether more Scots have access to a hut will be down to whether barriers posed by the planning system and land ownership can be overcome.
Somebody said to me recently, having a hut is like having a little bit of heaven, and they can just relax. They can just go there, they know they can relax, they've got what they need, and it's just a little bit of heaven on your doorstep. And I think that's really lovely.
And that's not Wi-Fi, is it?
No. Heaven doesn't come in Wi-Fi.
Well, I'm joined now by the writer Leslie Riddoch, who's currently working on a PhD about hutting and the Scandinavian experience. Thanks for coming in, Leslie. What impediments are there in Scotland that mean that we don't have huts on anything like the scales that Scandinavians do?
Well, the terrible irony of this is that the Scots did start in the 1920s, the same time all over Europe. People were trying to get out of cities that were actually killing them. They were such unhygienic places. The Scots were no different, despite the huge impediment of not having any easy access to land. But what's happened since then is that bit by bit there's been evictions, just like described at Barry Downs. But actually, in Scots law, you don't seem to have any rights as a tenant unless you're a permanent occupant. Now, that's meant that over the generations, as those initial ties between a landowner and hutters have diminished, and perhaps it's looked more attractive to put something that makes more money on the land, these hutters have really not a leg to stand on legally, and they've all bit by bit been evicted. So
without fundamental reform of land ownership in Scotland, is it going to be impossible to really encourage hutting all over the place?
Well, I think what will happen here is that pilot in Salin is actually on Forestry Commission land. So nearly all the Scandinavian huts are actually in woods. There's an awful lot more small private owners of woodland than there is in Scotland. Everything in Scotland tends to be much larger, and there tends to be one monopoly owner. So really it's important that the Forestry Commission have made this step. They've got lots of forest. They've got lots of places that would be great for people to have huts. And what we see nowadays all too often, if you go along any of the lochs in the middle of the summer, you see the Scots in the classic Scots position between the road and the loch, in the metre between it. Now we're the only people in the north of Europe who would tolerate that and not look across the road at the beautiful woodlands that lie beyond.
And you've experienced some of this in Scandinavia as well, and you're working on a PhD about it. Does it make a cultural difference? I mean, you'd see why it make a difference to you yourself if you can get away at the weekend, and if that's what you enjoy, then great. But does it make a social difference to the country?
Well, hugely. I mean, one thing is, first of all, that the kids, the main thing actually that all hutters in the Nordics report is that the biggest thing they get out of being in a hut is not actually connecting with nature, it's not relaxing, it's reconnecting with their own families. People tend to
because they're not sat all looking at their phones and their tablets all weekend.
And because they're actually doing things. I mean, work is not just salaried labour. It's actually the fun of trying to do some dodgy repairs yourself. It's doing everything outside. In many of the Nordic countries, the entire workplace, the sink, the tables, everything are outside for the full 3 months. And it's just that way. Easter, for example, is a huge time for huts as well. And they often ask me, but if you don't all have a hut to go to, how do your families reconnect at Easter? Well, how do we?
Good question. Leslie Riddoch, thanks for coming in to talk to us.